Hello, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about Fred Grabbe. The Grabbe family was wealthy by small town standards. They were easily one of the wealthiest families in Marshall, Illinois, a tiny farming town just 10 miles from Indiana border. Most of their wealth came from the inheritance that Charlotte Grabbe had acquired from her parents. Both Charlotte and her husband Fred were extremely hard workers. They worked long hours farming their soybean and cornfield, but their life was far from perfect. The couple had 2 children, Jeff and Jenny, and when there were problems between their parents, the kids usually took Charlotte's side. Fred and Charlotte had been married for 23 years, filled with violence, so much so that they had divorced once and remarried. The second marriage looked to be headed toward divorce as well. Fred was an extremely large man, standing at 6'4", while Charlotte was petite. During their heated arguments, Fred had no problem using his fists on his tiny wife or son Jeff. Things had gotten so bad that Charlotte had instructed Jeff and Jenny to come looking for her if she wasn't back to the house by the end of the workday. Fred was also a serial philanderer, and at 42 years old had a fascination with younger women, usually having a few girlfriends on the side at any given time. Fred was currently dating a 24-year-old curly-haired blonde bartender named Vicky McAllister. After learning of Fred's latest affair, Charlotte filed for divorce, and Fred moved out of the family home into a cabin on the family farm. Jeff and his wife moved into the main family house with Charlotte. Shortly after Fred moved into the cabin, Charlotte filed battery charges against him after he assaulted her when she went to the cabin to take some furniture back to the main house. A little after sundown on July 24th, 1981, Charlotte hadn't returned to the house. Jeff and Jenny knew something was wrong. She had gone out to the soybean field on her tractor, but hadn't returned by sundown, so they went looking for her. Later that evening, they found the tractor she had been driving parked inside a machine shed with her lunchbox still resting on the front tire. Jenny immediately went home and reported her mother missing to the Clark County Sheriff. When questioned by the sheriff, Fred admitted they had a quarrel, but said the last time he saw her, she was driving her car toward the interstate highway. A few days later, Charlotte's car was found in Terre Haute, Indiana, just 16 miles away across the state border. Police searched her vehicle and found no blood or signs of foul play, but they did find a loaded handgun beneath the seat. Contrary to Fred's story, a friend of Charlotte's came forward and told the sheriff she saw Fred driving his truck towards Terre Haute with someone following in Charlotte's car, someone other than Charlotte. They claimed the person driving Charlotte's car was a young blonde woman with curly hair. Investigators found that Charlotte had placed notes in a safe deposit box at the local bank just 10 days before she went missing. In those notes, she wrote that she thought Fred was stealing farm equipment and that she didn't think she would live through a divorce. She said she was afraid of Fred and his business partner, Del Kessler. The sheriff questioned Del Kessler, who claimed Fred was with him on the evening Charlotte went missing. At Jeff and Jenny's request, the sheriff brought Fred and Vicky McAllister before a grand jury, but both of them refused to talk, invoking their Fifth Amendment right. Jenny even asked her father to take a lie detector test to prove he didn't kill her mother. He refused. Charlotte's case went cold for 3 years. Jenny and her husband offered a $1,000 reward for information. They later raised it to $10,000, then again to $25,000, but nobody came forward. Eventually, Jenny hired a private investigator, Charles Pearson. Pearson decided to follow the clue of the curly-haired blonde driving Charlotte's car. Clearly, Pearson believed the woman driving the car was Vicky McAllister, and he wanted to talk to her. Pearson heard that Fred and Vicky had broken up, and she was now living in West Terre Haute, Indiana. Pearson said, quote, "There seemed to be 2 things she liked to do, drink beer and play pool. So I started going to the bars in the area and doing both. I met her, and we became friendly." Unquote. When Pearson finally admitted to her who he really was and why he befriended her, she couldn't help herself but to spill the beans. He said the information just poured out of her, like she really needed to get it off her chest. The secret she had been holding inside was eating her alive, and she was more than willing to come clean. McAllister admitted that she was the one driving Charlotte's car that day. That was just the beginning. She went on to describe the gruesome details of what happened the night and the following day. Vicky McAllister's story made her physically ill each time she told it. The story would eventually be told to authorities and later to 2 jurors. McAllister recalled that she was with Fred Grabbe in the machine shed the day to go get 55-gallon metal barrels to use for farm work. As they were getting the barrels, they heard Charlotte's tractor, and Fred told Vicky to hide behind another tractor inside the shed. Fred went outside to the shed to meet Charlotte. When they got into a heated argument, the argument escalated as they came back inside the shed. Eventually, Fred couldn't control his rage and began strangling her. Using his bare hands, he choked her neck until the point she was almost unconscious. He then released and let her regain consciousness, then choked again. He would repeat this over and over again until eventually he choked his wife to death. Once Charlotte was dead, he then sodomized her lifeless body while Vicky watched. Fred then grabbed a grease gun from the shed, filled all of Charlotte's orifices with grease. He crumbled her body into one of the 55-gallon barrels and loaded the barrel into the back of his pickup truck. Grabbe instructed Vicky to drive Charlotte's green Ford LTD that was parked outside and follow him as he drove his truck across the state line into Indiana. That night, they dumped Charlotte's car outside of a bar in Terre Haute and then drove back to Grabbe's farm and parked near the Wabash River. Grabbe took the barrel out of his truck and placed it near the maple tree, where he poured diesel fuel in the barrel covering Charlotte's body. He then lit it on fire. Fred and Vicky sat on the riverbank while the barrel burned. The diesel fuel and the grease inside her body burned slowly all night long. The next morning, they heard the search party approaching, so they put out the fire, loaded the drum back into Fred's truck with Charlotte's charred body inside, and headed back to Vicky's home. At sunset that night, they went back to the river, put the barrel in the same spot, and set it ablaze again. Again, it burned all night. In the morning, Fred rolled the barrel into the river. The only body part remaining was Charlotte's skull, to which he said, quote, "This will make good fish bait," unquote, as he threw it into the river. Vicky's confession helped, but it simply wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed some sort of physical evidence to charge Grabbe. With no body, no barrel, and no murder weapon, investigators need something besides Vicky McAllister's word against Fred's. Officially, Charlotte was still just a missing person. The new sheriff in Clark County was Dan Crumrin, and he was curious if the maple tree that still stood above the burn site could somehow be used. Crumrin asked the University of Illinois for help, and they sent a plant biologist, Eugene Heimlich, and an organic chemist, Donald Dickerson. During the natural cycle of a tree's life, the season will cause a tree to grow in the spring and summer, then go dormant in the winter. This process each year creates the familiar ring in the trunk and branches of every tree. A ring in the tree's branch will show the growth of that year. Diesel fuel is highly toxic to a tree, and if it doesn't kill the tree, it will at the very least hamper the growth. Heimlich and Dickerson took samples from the branches of the maple tree. Their findings concluded that 3 rings deep, meaning 3 years ago, the growth of the tree was much thinner. The tree had gone through some sort of stress the summer that Charlotte went missing. They then took the samples and shredded them into sawdust, which Dickerson analyzed using gas chromatograph mass spectator. A mass spectator is a device that identifies the components of a sample, even in very tiny amounts. In their analysis, they found the presence of hydrocarbons found in diesel products. There were a total of 5 branches tested. The 2 branches located on the side of the tree that the barrel was on showed the hydrocarbons. The other tree on the opposite side did not. The forensic evidence was enough to convict Fred Grabbe. One of the prosecutors used in the trial was Robert Egan of Chicago. Egan had been the prosecutor on the trial of John Wayne Gacy, a serial killer convicted for the murders of 33 young men in 1980. Fred Grabbe was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the story is far from over. During the trial, Fred had the support of his latest girlfriend, Barbara Graham, a twice-divorced mother of 3 from a nearby town. Fred had purchased her a mink coat that she wore in the courthouse during the trial to torment the family. A few weeks after Grabbe's conviction, he was held in the Clark County jail when Barbara Graham attempted to break him out. Barbara showed up at the jail and told Deputy Sheriff Mike Paulson that she wanted to give Fred a love note. When Paulson opened the door, she fired 5 shots, one hitting the deputy in the leg. She then hovered over him and said, quote, "Don't make me kill you," unquote. Graham's attempt, however, was unsuccessful. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison for that crime. The judge that sentenced Grabbe to prison was convinced that Fred had somehow planned the breakout attempt from behind bars. Just 2 months later, with Fred still in prison, the Grabbe home and the home that Fred's son Jeff had built nearby both burned to the ground. Fire marshals determined that both fires were intentionally set. Police suspected that Fred had something to do with it from prison, but since he was already serving life sentence, they didn't pursue it. During Fred's imprisonment, his lawyers filed an appeal of his verdict and got his first conviction overturned on a technicality. By this time, Vicky McAllister was living another life under another name, but she came back to Clark County to testify against Fred once again. Just a month before the second trial, Fred's son Jeff, who had testified at the first trial, had vanished. He was on a business trip in California when all family members lost contact with him. By the time of the trial date, Jeff was nowhere to be found. The judge allowed his wife Cindy to testify in his absence. Despite Jeff's absence, Fred was again convicted a second time and sentenced to 75 years in prison. 1 month after the trial, Jeff's body was found floating in the water at Seal Beach in California. 3 bullet holes riddled his body, and an anchor was tied around him to keep the body down. To this day, Fred denies having anything to do with his son's murder. Vicky McAllister received the $25,000 reward that Jenny and her husband had offered and was relocated under yet another assumed name. She still lives in fear that Fred will somehow find her from behind bars. As of 2018, Fred Grabbe is inmate number N57941 at Menard Correctional Center in Centralia, Illinois. He is eligible for parole in 2022. In yet another strange twist to this family story, years later in 2014, Fred's grandson Adam Everett Livix indicted on weapon and immigration charges in Netanya, Israel. He was suspected of impersonating a Navy SEAL and plotting bombing attacks on Dome of the Rock, an iconic mosque in Israel. Livix was diagnosed as being psychotic and unfit to stand trial. He was held in the mental institution in Israel for a year before he was released back to the U.S., where he faced charges of stealing farm. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.